Well, good evening once more. Hope you were able to have a wonderful time this morning worshiping with us, wherever you were able to worship. We come here once more to close out the Lord's Day with a little bit of word from the Word. We've been going through Lamentations. Again, I'm Pastor John Stovall, my wife Alexis, and you may see Mia here. You'll probably hear Mia chomping on things, but we come here continuing in our study in Lamentations. You know that we've been going through what it looks like to lament successfully. You know, we began this several weeks ago, trying to cope with the isolation, anxiety, the difficulty of life under COVID-19. And, well, we're continuing with it, even as things begin to resume, because it is critical for us to really understand what it looks like to face the judgment of the Lord in some sense, to face the difficulty, the anxiety, the weightiness of hard times. What do you do with difficult times? And so if you have a copy of the Word, I'd just encourage you to have it open to Lamentations chapter 4. We'll be looking at it as we go through. We'll look at the whole chapter today. And again, just to remind you, this is the third chapter in the book out of 4 that is an acrostic. 22 verses, each verse and each line in that verse beginning with the letter A in the first, and then Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and so on. In the Hebrew, right? 22 consonants in the Hebrew alphabet, so 22 verses in Lamentations 4. That's familiar, of course. We encounter it in the first 2 chapters each, and so this is the third one. And again, it provides an order to what really, by this time, has become sort of a routine. You know, one of the things that you can do in grief, what often happens when folks suffer a severe loss, when you lose your job, you know, and you're let go, what do? Well, the next 2 weeks, you meditate. You think back on, why did I lose that job? What could I have done differently? What did they see in me? How did I fail? How did they fail me? One of the things you do is that you replay the events over and over again. And that's helpful. It can be helpful, certainly. It can be dangerous, but it can be helpful. And we see here in chapter 4 a replay of the events of the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. Remember that this book takes place after those events, kind of in reaction to the destruction of Jerusalem, of the holy city of God, the destruction of the temple, the plunder of the city, the death of the people, the exile of Israel, the failure, it looks like, of all the promises of God. And you know, the Bible really hits that home in these first 10 verses. You know, the text is kind of divided into 3 parts. Verse 1 to verse 10 is the first part, and looking at just the reversals. This is a study in contrast, a study in what once was amazing, what once was glorious, has been ruined. You see at the very first verse, how the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. Israel was golden. They were the golden boys. They were beautiful. The land was great. The people were meant to be privileged, and they were. They had the Lord with them at every turn. They had the prophets. They had the promises. They had the land. They had been granted victory over all of their foes. They had been given money. Remember in 1 Kings how we looked at Solomon's court and Solomon's temple, and what word is repeated in Solomon's temple all the time? Gold. Everything's gold in the temple. And yet that gold has grown dim. That's the first contrast we'll see throughout these 10 verses. It's what you expect has been completely changed. It's like that Disney scene in The Hunchback of Notre Dame where it's topsy-turvy day and everything becomes upside down. So, for example, verse 2, the sons of Zion, worth their weight in gold. That's where we get this phrase from, right? You're worth your weight in fine gold. Well, now they're regarded as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. Now, that's actually a good image, right? The Bible talks about us being the clay and God being the potter who forms the clay, particularly in Romans. But here, pottery that's made by your hands out of earth, out of dirt and clay, compared to gold, it's worthless. It's common. It's ordinary. It's not special at all. And so in this siege, right, the grief is that everything has been reversed. Everything has been changed. In fact, verse 3 gets even deeper. We're going to go through all of this a bit by bit. You'll see just how terrible it gets. Verse 3 looks at the animal kingdom, looks at the jackals. You know, jackals or hyenas are notoriously wild, disorganized. But even the hyenas nurse their young. Even the hyena mommies care for their little children. But here's the problem in Jerusalem. The daughter of my people has become cruel. The mothers are no longer compassionate. I mean, what is more loving? What is more basic to humanity than the love of a mother for her child? Nothing. It's one of the most basic loves in the whole universe. And yet here, the daughter of my people has become cruel like an ostrich. It was thought in those days that the ostriches would abandon their eggs, abandon their young. That may or may not be true. It's not a biological statement, but the daughter of my people has become like an ostrich, abandoning their kids. And so we find in verse 4 what's happened. The nursing infant, this is a tragic picture. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. Just picture that. I mean, the children beg for food. This is what happens in warfare. Who gets hurt? Disproportionately, the most. Well, the women and the kids. They beg for food. Nobody gives it to them. Starvation. But not just the kids. The rich, those who feasted on delicacies, those who had gourmet foods. You know, they ate Gordon Ramsay every day. Well, now they're dying in the streets. Those who wore purple, those who had rich clothes, now they're living in the ash heaps. In this time of destruction, in this tragedy, everyone is involved. Not just the poor, not just the rich, not just the babies, not just the moms. Everybody is. In fact, the poet says here the chastisement, verse 6, of the daughter of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom. Literally, the transgression of the daughter of my people has been greater than the sin of Sodom. Why? Well, because Sodom was destroyed in a moment. But here, the siege took months. The people were beautiful, but all the beautiful people are now blacker. Their faces are blacker than soot. You can't see them in the streets. I mean, imagine if you were to see, you know, you're famous, whatever actor you like, whatever sports star you like, you can pick one, right? You were to see them walking down the street. You know their face. You see them all the time in pictures online or on the TV. Well, we all know the famous people. Well, now imagine their faces covered in soot. Imagine their skin shriveled up. It's what you think of when you think of terror, when you think of genocides like those in Rwanda, when you think of the tragedies in the Balkans in the 1990s, when you think of the Holocaust, when you think of 9/11. All of these things that they pierce our prosperity. They are tragedies that pierce our bubble of security. And in some ways, this coronavirus has done the same. It should have caused us to grieve a little, at least. And then we get down to really the most tragic part, right? Verse 9, verse 10. Verse 9 literally says, good, better were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger. How is it better to die by the sword than to die by hunger? There's only one way. It's quicker. That's it. Then finally, verse 10, the culmination of everything. Terrible. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food. during the destruction of the daughter of my people. So that's the first 10 verses. Tragic image there. The hands that were meant to be compassionate. Again, the love of a mother for her child. Well, those hands have taken and they have literally served their children. This is what war does. This is what famine does. This is what the horrors that can come upon the people, even humans in the 21st century, can come upon us as well. Perhaps not here, perhaps not yet, perhaps not now. But this is the destruction that occurs. Yes, Alexis.
Were those things actually happening, do we think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure
Yeah.
if it was more.
It's not just poetic. Yeah,
Poetic.
We wish it would be, right? We want it to be poetic. We don't want to think about this, but we know both in the ancient Near East and during the siege of Jerusalem, this is what occurred. But notice there's one phrase that keeps on repeating through all of this grief. It's repeated 3 times. Verse 3, verse 6, verse 10. The daughter of my people. My people. My people. My people. The great tragedy is that this is happening to my people. Whose people? God's people. The Lord's people. All of these reversals. I mean, you think of Christians, you think of what it means to be a Christian, you think of somebody who's strong. Often we think of somebody who's morally upright. We think of someone who's got it all together, maybe. Well, this is what happens to my people, to God's people. This is the destruction, the devastation, the calamity. It is a complete disaster. And we're meant to, in one sense, wallow in it. And that sounds terrible because we don't. No one likes wallowing. I mean, this is not going to win any popularity awards, for favorite Bible passage. But it's here in the Word of God for a reason. It's here so that we can learn how to grieve well. And of course, even as you think of this reversal, right? We'll have to put all this chapter together in a few minutes and see how do we as Christians read this now. But before we do that, the Lord moves on. Verse 11 to verse 16. We won't read all those verses. I'll just point out a couple of things here. God has given full vent to his wrath. He has poured out judgment upon Zion, upon his precious one. This is shocking because this is the same God who brought his people out of Egypt. This is the same God who smote Og in the desert, the wilderness. He destroyed all the Canaanites. He fought for his people and they won. How can Jerusalem fall? I mean, what is Babylon compared to Egypt or Assyria? Both of whom God defeated. Surely God can defeat Babylon, but he did. And that's the shock. Why did he not do it? Well, there is one cause given here, verse 13. This was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests. Now, this is surprising, perhaps. Why? What is the cause? What's the cause for all of this calamity? Of course, there's many causes, but here it's laid at the leadership, the prophets, the sins of her prophets, the iniquities of her priests, who shed the blood of the righteous in her midst. The leadership of Israel. Those who were to speak God's word, the prophets, those who were to offer on behalf of the people the sacrifices to God, the priests, the ones who were counted holy, well, now they're defiled. The ones who were going to go care for the lepers have themselves become lepers. They're unclean. Verse 15, don't touch them. They've become fugitives. They who were supposed to be at the center of Israelite holiness and piety. Do we see how important it is that the leadership of God's people is holy? Do we see here the importance of those who are called to be officers, particularly in the church of God? Would they be tested? Would they be approved? And do we see here how great a need we have as Christians to look to the one who is the great prophet, the one who is the great priest, the one who does not shed the blood of the righteous, but Jesus Christ himself, who sheds his own blood for our salvation. And yet, as we kind of look towards the ending of this, you see it's really a complete disaster. Verse 18, the enemies are dogging their steps. They couldn't even walk in their own streets. The end has come. You can just imagine the poet retelling the story, thinking about it over and over again, remembering what had happened. And then verse 20 is really the worst part of the whole thing. The breath of our nostrils, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. That's an interesting way to talk about somebody. The breath of our nostrils. I mean, what's the breath of your nostrils? What's your life breath? You breathe, right? You need to be able to breathe to have life. And who is that? The Lord's anointed. Who's the Lord's anointed? The King of Israel. You think of David. You think of Solomon. You think of those who are called to be, who are anointed to be the king in Israel, the man in charge, the great leader, the one who would shepherd their people well, the one who's supposed to live and rule over the nations, among the nations. Well, where is he? What happened to Zedekiah, Jehoiachin? They're blinded. They're taken. They're in the pits of Babylon. They're captured. I mean, this is God's anointed one. How can this even have a future? How can Israel even, after all of this has occurred? I mean, if verse 20 was the end of the Bible, that would make sense in one sense. Because everything has gone haywire. Everything has gone wrong. The promises of God seem to be completely null and void. Babylon wins. The false gods win, it looks like. And yet then, I mean, just look at the first words in verse 21. You have this complete and utter 20 verses of grief and horror and anguish and sorrow and lamenting and crying and weeping. And then you have this. I mean, look at what it says. Rejoice and be glad. How can there be any joy in any of this? How can there be any gladness in any of this? Oh, but wait a second. Who's the poet talking about? He's not talking about Israel. Suddenly, there's this weird switch at the very end. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom. Who's Edom? Well, that's Esau land. Remember Esau and Jacob, right? The two brothers who fought. Jacob, later called Israel, right? The one whom the Lord brought out of exile back to his land, through whom Christ would come. Right? Jacob, the schemer who himself got schemed on. He was always afraid of Esau. Esau was big. Esau was brawny. Esau had some strength. Well, Esau eventually made Edom. And Edom was Israel's enemy all their time. They're the prototypical people who hate the church of God, who hate Israel. And in fact, during the siege of Jerusalem in 587, we know from archaeology that Edom stood by. They didn't help Israel at all. In fact, they came in afterwards and they stole some part of the territory near Jerusalem. They were like scavengers. They picked over the bones afterwards. Well, what are they going to get? They're going to get the cup. They're going to get the cup of God's judgment. What do we see from that? Well, we see that the Lord knows all that takes place, right? He will look upon those who attack the church. He will look upon anyone who acts unjustly, whether you can see it, whether the news shows it or not. And he will uncover and expose on that great day of judgment. And that's part of our hope. But where's hope for Israel in all this? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, great, the enemies are going to get it too, but what if you're the mom who has to boil her kid alive? What if you have to be the person to whom all this reversal takes place? I mean, what if in the Christian church in America or in the West goes into a time of dimness? What if this takes place? What if there is punishment upon the church for her lack of leadership. What if all these things take place? What if it takes place in your life? And the successes you had, and the health you had, and the life you had, well, they get snuffed out. You know, you lose the job, you lose the hope, you lose everything you once thought you had. What if reversals? What if the calamities hit you and they don't stop? What do you do then? There is only one line in this whole chapter that offers any hope. It's the very end, verse 22. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He, God, will keep you in exile no longer. He will keep you in exile no longer. What do we do with this chapter? What do we do with that one line of promise? It's just a hint, just a little taste of what's going to come. God will not keep his people in exile forever. He will not abandon them to exile. Why? Because their punishment is accomplished. And their punishment, earthly punishment, right? Earthly destruction of Jerusalem for their earthly sins, their earthly disloyalty, their failure in the theocratic society of Israel of that day in the Old Testament to keep the law, their failure, okay? Our sins, our failure to keep the law, our failure to love God, our failure to love our neighbor. Where's our punishment? I mean, we're not experiencing these things, entirely right now. Where's our punishment? Can we read verse 22 and say, yes, I believe this? Yes, we can as Christians. Do you know why? Because the punishment of our iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Zion. Where was it accomplished? It was accomplished when Jesus Christ took the wounds in his side. When he says, it is finished. It is accomplished. It is done. He took on the covenant curses. That's why the earth was dark. That's why the earthquakes occurred. That's why the temple was torn in two. That's why the gold became dim on one Good Friday. Because the punishment of the iniquity that we were due was accomplished. And that means God's not going to keep you in exile forever. He's not going to keep his church in exile forever. He's not going to keep his people trapped forever. Not just in terms of COVID-19 and getting back to normalcy, but it means that in our life, when we grieve, when you are in the pit, when you feel like the Lord's anointed is captured in the pit, you feel like there's no way out. Do you see this promise? It's a tiny promise. It may not feel like much to you at the time. It's one line out of 22 verses. But do you see, not just that punishment comes to God's people, and it does, but do you see that the hope that appears, that God will not keep us in exile? You see, because the Lord's anointed was captured in the pits. He was captured and captive by Satan and all his minions. He was taken under the bar of injustice. He was exiled himself. That's why Hebrews can say, right? Maybe you know this. That's why the book of Hebrews can say in Hebrews 13, verse 12, so Jesus also suffered outside the camp in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Christ suffered outside the camp. What does that even mean? Well, he went to the place of trash. He went to the place where you put the carcasses of the dead animals. He went to the place where the defiled lepers were supposed to go, outside the camp. So for all of us who have defiled ourselves with blood, for all of us who've experienced the judgment of God in some way upon our lives, do you realize that in Jesus Christ, the Lord's anointed was held captive under the power of death for a time, that you and I might have his unfading, unfailing, ever-living resurrection life forever. So you may feel like you're in exile. But do you taste the return? We have a taste of heaven right now. We have a taste of what heaven's like every time we come to the church. Every time we read the word, every time we're encouraged by fellow Christians, every time we show forth the good works of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. Every time we persevere, every time we follow what the Lord says and what the Word says, and not what our own hearts say, not what our feelings say, not what the cool kids say. Every time we do those things, every time we witness to Christ, what are we doing? We are declaring that our hope, though the worst things may come, though we're feeling down, though we're grieving, though we're depressed, what do? We look to the Lord himself and to his promise that he will keep us in exile no longer. Let's do that, friends. Don't be surprised when calamity comes. Don't assume that Christians never are victims of hunger or the sword, that we never experience reversals. But in Christ, the ultimate reversal, the reversal of the light being swallowed up by the darkness, the ultimate reversal has taken place so that you and I who live in darkness can enter the kingdom of light, so that you and I who live in death can be made alive again. Do you see the reversal? And without it, you can't be a Christian. You got to see the reversal. Christ gives you his life through his death, that you who are dead might live forever. Praise be to God. Well, thank you for your time this evening. And once more, we ask you, you want to come back again next week. We will conclude our study of Lamentations here in chapter 5. And if you have any questions or comments, you can certainly get in touch with me. Happy to answer them. Hope you have a great rest of your Sunday evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the days to come. Thanks so much.
We do. Good night.
Good night.